so many people here. My name is Jerry Cowbig. I live in Bristol, and I'm a friend of Sheila's, and she invited me again, as I did last time, to chair this evening. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. We have three excellent speakers: Dan Glazebrook, Sami Ramadani, and Jeremy Corbyn, MP. Our first speaker, Dan Glazebrook. Dan is a political writer and journalist. He writes regularly on international relations for Counterpunch, an excellent American newsletter you can also see online, and Al Ahram online. He's also contributed to both The Guardian and The New Statesman. Regularly appears on TV on channels such as Russia Today and Press TV. And Dan is going to speak to us about US, Britain and the destruction of Syria. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you. There was a document, very interesting document released recently, almost completely ignored in the Western press, with the honourable exception of the Morning Star, of course, which detailed discussions between the British Prime Minister and the US President. I'm going to read you some quotes from this document to see if you, like me, think that it's perhaps worthy of more attention than has hitherto been paid to it, this document. So this is an agreement between, it was a plan formulated by the US President and the British Prime Minister. Some quotes. Once a political decision has been reached to proceed with internal disturbances in Syria, the CIA is prepared and MI6 will attempt to mount minor sabotage and coup incidents within Syria, working through contacts with individuals. Went on, the Prime Minister and the President agreed that they would fund the, quote, Free Syria Committee and, quote, arm political factions with paramilitary or other actionist capabilities within Syria. They would then launch various strong-armed activities, which would then be blamed on Damascus. The document goes on to say that quote, a necessary degree of fear through frontier incidents and border clashes would, quote, provide a pretext for intervention. Now, this document was discovered in 2003 by Matthew Jones, a reader in international history at London's Royal Holloway College. It was actually from 1957. The agreement was between US President Eisenhower and British Prime Minister Macmillan. But I would suggest that if anyone thinks that these kinds of activities are no longer going on, it would be worth looking at a couple of other more recent revelations, particularly the interview on French TV, I think it was earlier this year, from Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister, who said that he was in Britain on official business 2 years before the start of the Arab Spring, when he discussed with his British counterparts Syria, and they said to him that they were about to launch, they were planning a destabilization campaign against Syria, and this was what he revealed to be already in the quite advanced planning stages 2 years before the Arab Spring began in early 2011. I'd also suggest people have a look, if you guys haven't already, you should go home straight away and Google it. A 2007 article by Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker called The Redirection, in which he spells out, based on high-level interviews of high-level US officials, Saudi officials, Lebanese politicians, a US and Saudi plan to arm sectarian Sunni militias across the region and turn them against Syria. In fact, there's another quote, I'm not going to load up my laptop again, but the quote is something like, this is from a US government consultant, something like, it's not that we're against the Salafis throwing bombs. Salafis are sectarian Sunni militias operating throughout the region. It's not that we're against the Salafis throwing bombs, it's who they throw the bombs at. We want them to be throwing them at Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq, at Hezbollah in Lebanon, at Iran, and at Syria, if Syria continues to ally itself with Iran and Hezbollah. So, when we hear this narrative that the war and the destabilization going on in Syria, the violence in Syria is solely the result of a violent crackdown by the Syrian government against peaceful demonstrators, we need to bear in mind that actually this destabilization campaign has been planned in London, Washington and Paris, funded by the Saudis, and executed by militias from across the region, and actually closer to the reality of how this whole situation came about is to understand that actually demonstrations were used as a cover for the launching of an effectively imperialist proxy war against Syria. And that's exactly what's going on. In this context, it's worth having a look at the initial outbreak of fighting in the port city of Daraa in Syria in March 2011, where snipers fired at an anti-government demonstration. At this time, from February 2011, March 2011 onwards, there were huge anti-government and huge pro-government demonstrations in Syria. And the incident that is, as I understand it, pretty much accepted on all sides to have been the kind of trigger for the violence is snipers firing at this demonstration in this small town, Daraa. No one knows who these snipers were exactly. It seems that they killed not only demonstrators but Syrian police as well, which is interesting. But we do know there was an arguably comparable situation in Venezuela in 2002, where snipers were firing at anti-government demonstrators. This was in the time of the late and much lamented Hugo Chavez. And these snipers were firing at an anti-government demonstration in order to, we now know, that they were actually members of the organised opposition to Chavez, firing on the demonstration in order to destabilise the situation and create the chaos which would pave the way for the attempted coup that came about in the days that followed. This much we know. Back to Syria, we also know that this incident with these snipers was very quickly followed by a massive onslaught, armed insurrection, huge violent onslaught against Syrian police, soldiers, and even pro-government civilians. The narrative was kept out of the Western press for pretty much the whole first year of the uprising. Obviously now it's well known that the opposition are armed and have Al-Qaeda elements and all this kind of stuff. But for pretty much the first year, the narrative was, look, these are peaceful demonstrators being massacred by Assad. Every figure that came out of deaths in Syria were all attributed to the Syrian government. In fact, that famous UN report that said there were 93,000 deaths in Syria, in fact, it attributed 45,000 deaths, it said, were actually government soldiers and police, 45,000 had been killed. It'd be interesting to see how the British government reacted to 45,000 of its soldiers and police being massacred. I would be interested to see their response to that. I wanted to also just briefly address the role of Britain specifically in this war. With the recent vote in Parliament, it's been, it shouldn't allow us to think that Britain is not going to be involved or is not already involved in the Syrian war. Britain has been deeply involved since the start, and arguably it now looks like those documents I was referring to since long before the start of the war. The Mirror, not always the most reliable newspaper necessarily, but nevertheless the Mirror reported that the SAS is on the ground in Syria already, hunting for those weapons of mass destruction. It's known, it was reported in The Guardian earlier this year, that British forces are running training camps for the rebels in Jordan. Britain has overtly equipped the rebels to the tune of millions of pounds worth of military equipment, so-called non-lethal military equipment, things, communications equipment, night vision goggles and things that will help the death squads and militias in Syria kill people without actually providing the final bullets to do so. As well as this, Britain's sold not millions but billions of pounds worth of weaponry to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Averages around about 2 billion per year arms sales to Saudi Arabia from Britain. And Saudi Arabia and Qatar is well known in turn supplying weapons to the rebels. So Britain's got, British government has blood on its hands in this conflict and has done from the very start. But the worst aspect of the British involvement, I would argue, has been their consistent sabotaging of any prospect for peace in Syria. Not only by this ridiculous and arrogant insistence that the Syrian president must go, and therefore basically ruling out any chance of a negotiated settlement, because he's not allowed, the actual representative of the Syrian government, not allowed to negotiate, according to Britain and their allies, British government. But also, there's some very specific cases where there have been chances for peace talks that have come about. And if we look at how the British government have responded to them, every time it's hard to draw a conclusion other than that they were deliberately responding in such a way as to scupper the prospect of peace talks. So if we just look earlier this year when the so-called Geneva II peace talks were proposed, how did Britain respond? Within days was arm twisting at the EU to try and end the arms embargo so that weapons could be sold to the rebels. This is obviously an incentive to the rebels to keep fighting, to not negotiate, not go into negotiations, not go into peace talks. Don't worry, we're with you, we're going to supply you more weapons. If we look at the military situation on the ground, the Geneva II talks were proposed just after quite a serious defeat for the rebel militias in Syria, in the town of Qusair. Some of them come to the conclusion perhaps a military victory is impossible, perhaps a negotiated settlement would be the best way forward. Britain, by arm twisting the EU, ending that embargo, is trying to encourage the rebels to continue to believe in this delusion that a military victory is possible, to keep fighting, to boycott peace talks. No surprise that within days of Britain and France successfully ending the EU arms embargo, the Free Syrian Army came out and said that we boycotting the peace talks. The Syrian government has accepted the peace talks, by the way. But the Free Syrian Army, after that manoeuvring by Britain and France, decided to boycott them and keep fighting. It's very similar to what happened about a year before, March 2012. Kofi Annan's peace plan was initially accepted pretty much by both sides. How did Britain's allies respond? By saying that they were going to pay salaries to Free Syrian Army fighters, and again, the prospect of giving them more serious equipment, again, all an incentive to keep fighting, don't negotiate. This is the message that they're sending every time. None of this, however, should detract from the fact that this colonial war by proxy is failing, and has been failing for some time. If you look, to a certain extent, the Western powers staked credibility on this idea of the Syrian state being destroyed. They've said Assad must go, then what happens if he doesn't go? It look ridiculous. They've staked a lot of credibility on it. And yet he hasn't gone. The Syrian government hasn't been destroyed. Syria hasn't been turned into Libya or Iraq just yet, although obviously it's in a horrific situation. But if we look at the defeats, they started off by funding this proxy war, organising this proxy war through Saudi Arabia and Qatar mainly. That's failed. They tried to put pressure early in the year on former Egyptian President Morsi to step up Egyptian involvement in the conflict. Now obviously with Morsi's removal, that has failed, and actually the new Egyptian government has completely cut all Egyptian fighters from going to fight in Syria against the Syrian government. So that avenue is blocked. They tried to isolate Syria from its allies, first by sending the Saudi Prince Bandar to try and bribe Russia to ditch Syria. That failed. Then by trying to intimidate Iran and Russia into accepting Western airstrikes. That too has failed. So, to conclude, I would say we need to be aware that the war is much more than just direct airstrikes by, European, American powers. War takes place on many levels. There's economic war, there's a propaganda war against Syria, there's proxy war, and we need to expose and oppose all of them. They are failing, we need to be clear on that, but only when all of these different elements are defeated will we see, finally, the real prospects of peace again in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan.